Hi, welcome everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining the National Curriculum for School Mental Health Overview by the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Zach Chavez. I work on the community engagement team at the Public Education Department of New Mexico. My focus is civic engagement, which is a focus on business and community leaders. But we engage with our communities at large, a lot of work with families, educators, and students. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Zach. And I've lost visual of everyone on my screen, but hoping I can change that back around. My name is Katie Avery. Good morning. I support the community engagement, constituent services, and communications teams at the Public Education Department. I joined the PED in December of last year, so had just a few months of meeting folks and getting to know a little bit more about the beautiful state of New Mexico. I relocated here from Washington, D.C., where I spent the last almost 20 years in public education, primarily as an early childhood bilingual Montessori educator, and then moving into a role as a charter school administrator. I most recently worked for a foundation that focused on family engagement work, specifically in the public schools in the District of Columbia. And I ran our teacher professional development program there as well. I'm gonna have an open facilitation moment here and ask if we can go ahead and poll just to see who is in the room with us this morning. Really wanna make sure that we can tailor our conversation to meet the needs of those in the room with us today. And thank you all for your patience as we navigate the tech with us today. We were just having a conversation about everybody being new to this world of virtual engagement. So it's going to make our conversation today a little bit different than the one that I think Zach and I are accustomed to facilitating when we talk about relationship building and the importance of establishing authentic connection with children and families in service to strong student outcomes. We understand and we recognize that's going to look a little bit different this year as we move into distance and hybrid and remote and all kinds of learning options with our families. So as we move through our session today, a few of the outcomes that we hope to accomplish are these. We really want to take time to reflect on our own identities, how we're showing up into relationship with students and families, especially given the circumstances, given the climate of our schools and communities right now, and how that influences the relationships that we form in the beginning of the school year. We're going to identify the core components of effective family engagement, and then I'll name some explicit synergies and connections with the SEL, specifically the CASEL framework that's being used to inform a lot of the SEL framework development work here in New Mexico. And then we're going to name and identify and explore some concrete strategies. So thinking about what does it mean to do practically when we talk about building relational trust, when we talk about two-way communication, meaningful partnership with families, academic partnership. What does that mean? What does that look like? We're also, in order to meet that third objective there, going to be sharing some PDFs with you at the close of this session. I believe Jackie said she's dropping them in the chat. And those have some really granular, specific suggestions for how to move through relationship and connections with families throughout the school year. So what is family engagement? As our host today mentioned, we're going to be breaking out into small group discussions early and often throughout our conversation today. Really want to make sure that you can engage in this discussion in a way that is meaningful and relevant to you. And so the first opportunity for that is going to be just after I talk us through this framework here. So our goal on the community engagement team at the Public Education Department is really threefold, but we assigned a lot more words to it here on this slide. So if we were live, I'd ask somebody at random to read this aloud. That can get a little wonky over Zoom. So Zach, since I can see your face, if you could read our goal aloud for us, please.
Sure. Foster authentic school-home relationships rooted in mutual trust and reciprocal accountability. Cultivate academic partnership opportunities that support student growth and equip families to monitor literacy development at home, provide culturally relevant and linguistically accessible resources for families to set high expectations, support a community of culture of learning and literacy, and advocate for individual children's needs.
Thank you so much, Zach. So that's a lot right there. That's a pretty lofty goal that we have. Want to give you some time to sort of sit with that and think about what resonates with you. What are you already doing to meet some of the goals identified here? If you had to pick out a couple pieces that were of a top priority as you re-enter schools this fall, what would those be? And how could you prioritize over distance, especially? And where might you need some additional support? So Jack, if we could go ahead into those small group discussions, I think we'll have about 4 minutes here to meet some new people and talk about what resonates. This language here will be copied into the chat box for your reference during that conversation. Fantastic, thank you. I hope you all got to meet some new friends. I had the pleasure of speaking with someone else here in Albuquerque, which is where I'm based, and another new friend in Roswell. But would love to open up some time in the chat box for any questions that are coming up as you look at this goal. One thing that came up in our conversations, it does involve a lot, right? And we're gonna break this down piece by piece throughout our conversation today. But Dana, if there are any questions emerging in the chat box, would love to take just a couple of minutes to address those here. Great. So one of the things that you'll notice that we call out here is not just the importance of relationships, but really rooting deeply in trust and reciprocal accountability and what that means as we enter partnership with families. So I want to just keep that theme alive in our minds as we continue the conversation today. We do call out literacy here. We know that that's a major focus, but that's not to the exclusion of other content areas or other pieces. We know and really value the importance of a holistic education. As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm a Montessori educator, so those familiar already know a little bit about my pedagogical bias, but want to make sure that we call out that that is a focus of our state, but certainly not to the exclusion of any of our other core and additional topics for students. Let's see if I did this right here so I can move us right along. All right, so before we tackle our objectives today, we wanted to just create a little bit of a foundational understanding for everybody present and talk a little bit about the why. So why is family engagement so important? And I'm sure everybody who signed up for this session has a why of their own. And if you want to share those with one another in the chat box, just to connect with each other, build a little bit of community and rapport here in conversation, please feel free to do so as I talk through the next couple of slides. So first and foremost, of course, family engagement is important because relationships matter, right? We are all human. We all have this connection. You're here at a socio-emotional learning conference. I think we can all appreciate the importance of having a relational foundation as you enter any sort of partnership or work with people that you may or may not know. What's unique to these relationships is that they're not chosen relationships, but they are necessary ones. Very seldom do we get to pick who is in our classroom and who the family attached to that person or child is, but they're really important, really necessary relationships. And so that's important to keep in mind too, as we talk about how we're showing up and navigating this engagement with the families of our students. In addition to that sort of warm, gooey, soft, loving reason why, there's a lot of research around family engagement. And what we know to be true is that students with high levels of partnership between their educators and their families earn higher grades and test scores. They enroll in higher level programs. So that's to say the deeper the relationship, the higher the expectation is of that child, and the more likely the child is to reach and achieve that high expectation. They're more likely to be promoted, pass their classes, and earn additional credits. They're more likely to have a higher rate of attendance. This is especially true in our middle and secondary classrooms. Oftentimes when we talk about family engagement, it's sort of organic to think about it in the early childhood or elementary setting when we're all, I myself am the parent of an elementary student, when we're all sort of a little bit more naturally inclined to be more heavily invested or engaged in our child's learning experience. It's equally as important for our secondary students as well. That's middle and high school students as well. Again, as my own mothering journey continues, I have a child in middle school also, and I feel that sort of transition happening where some of the things that I used to do to support her learning journey are now things that I'm hoping she can take on additional responsibility and autonomy in doing herself. But that attendance piece, we've seen positive impacts throughout the K-12 trajectory. Students with strong relationships between school and home also have better social skills, show improved behavior, adapt well to school. We know this is going to be critically important, that socialization piece, as we navigate distance learning. And they're more likely to graduate and go on to post-secondary education. So when we think about that sort of long-term trajectory for our students, we know that there are stronger and more positive outcomes for a lot of our kiddos in this case. This particular research was a culmination of, I think it's about 51 studies over the past 10 or so years. It was done by Henderson and Mapp. Dr. Karen Mapp is a leading expert on family engagement out of Harvard. And Ann Henderson has done a lot of work in family engagement, specifically around home visiting as a relationship building practice as well. We're going to jump right back into our next opportunity for engagement. And Jackie, if we could do larger groups this time, maybe 4 or 5 people, if the audience size allows for that. But in this conversation, I want you to think back, and if you're comfortable closing your eyes, fine. If your camera's already off, we don't know what you're doing with your eyes, that's also fine. But think of somebody who supported you in your own educational success. So just by the very virtue of being educators, you have achieved some level of academic success in your life that's gotten you to where you are. So I want you to think about your personal journey, root there for a second. Who are the people that supported you? What did they do? What did they say? Share those stories out in your small group breakouts. And then when we come back as a whole group, if you could be prepared to share in the chat box something you heard someone else say. Of course, we want you to get their consent before doing so, in case it's an embarrassing, oh, my dad used to always tell me this thing kind of story. But try to be connected to what other folks are saying and share out something you heard that resonated with you when we come back. So I'm going to just pause, do my best to offer some virtual wait time as folks type into the chat box. What are some things that you heard in the stories that were shared in your small group discussions around types of support that folks got in their educational journey?
Can you hear me? Hello?
We can, yes.
Oh, okay. Well, there was someone who was sharing that they keep daily numbers on attendance for the classrooms, and whichever classroom comes out ahead at the end of the month, they get a donut party or a pizza party. They have a party and celebrate and acknowledge their accomplishment.
Nice, some shared incentives.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing, Jane. I see another comment coming through. We hear a lot about coaches. So that sort of coaching mentality, somebody who set an expectation for you and supported you along the way. Zach, thank you for sharing. Can you tell us a little bit about the family support? What did that look like, sound like for you?
Yeah, so my teammates and I talked about our homes being supportive of pursuing education and getting to the next level. Furthermore, that was linked with meaningful mentorship at the school site. So that was either with a teacher or a coach, somebody taking a little bit of extra time went a long way for all of us.
Thank you so much for sharing. Can you guys see my screen okay now? Fantastic. I don't want to miss other comments that are coming in here. Let's see if I can open that back up. Oh, I don't think I can, right? I can't see it when I'm
So at the very top, you'll have like the normal options. There's a more button on the very right side. Under the more, there's the chat section.
Thank you. I think it's blocking because I have my presentation mode up over here. Not trying to give folks my focus. Are there any questions that came up in conversation here? Anything coming through the chat box needing to be addressed, Dana?
I'm not seeing anything, just comments, you know, other adult staff such as attendants, office, cafeteria, staff, coaches. Father was the educator, mom was the one who wanted to go to work that helped me strive to get a degree.
Oh, shit.
Great. Thank you for summarizing some of those. So I think we heard a lot of conversations so far around high expectations. And that partnership, so both high expectations in school and at home, and really supporting, having that asset-based mindset to support us as we went through our journeys. What we know is our friends over at Flamboyant Foundation out of DC, full disclosure, my former employer, but they've done a lot of research in this area, and in particular thinking about the roles that families can play that support student success. And so when we think about family engagement and we think about the why, this is the answer to that question: to what end, right? What is that thing or that way of being that we hope to see come to light? And it is that communicating high expectations. And so I had a conversation with somebody earlier about saying, you know, somebody shined light on this opportunity to go to college, and that was a new expectation. And then once that was communicated multiple times from multiple adults that cared for and supported me, that became a vision and it became a reality. Another thing families can do is monitor their child's progress at home. As we think about moving into distance learning and remote learning and hybrid options, this is going to be critically important. Again, anecdotally, as the mother of a middle schooler last spring when our schools closed down, I realized how out of touch I was, quite frankly, and I wasn't doing my part in playing this particular role and knowing, you know, which site to log into and how do I access information about grades and how do I encourage her to communicate with teachers when there are questions. So this monitoring piece is going to be really important, and we encourage you to think about what can you do to help bridge that relationship and help bridge that communication with families, whether it's technical support. If you're working with older students, maybe it's equipping and empowering them to do some of that self-monitoring and then sharing that information with their families as well. Families can also support learning at home, and so that can look like work packets. It can look like, I was an early childhood educator, so my examples always go back to that, but it can be, you know, as we ride the city bus home from school today, we're gonna read aloud all of the numbers on the houses that we see, and then maybe doing simple math verbalization in that aspect. Support learning at home is one in particular where we really need to rely on the relationships that we have with individual families. So that's to say, getting to know our families, getting to know their daily routines, getting to know their home language, all of that is going to inform what support looks like for learning at home, right? So based on accessibility, based on, again, language or culture, based on daily schedule, it's really important that we do that in partnership with families, that we're co-creating what those support systems look like so that it's responsive. And so it's really accessible so that it's not just one other thing, but here's how we weave it in and here's how we integrate learning into our daily routines at home. And finally, there's this piece around advocacy. So making sure that families have all of the information, all of the tools, all of the resources, all of the access, and are encouraged to exercise their agency in advocating for their child's educational needs. And this is really important, not just for students receiving special education services or any kind of individualized intervention or support, but really for all of our children, right? If we think about learning, especially at a distance or from home, families are going to be that key point person that you can rely on to tell you how their child learns best or what they notice about their child's behavioral or learning habits at home. And that's going to help advocate for what their child needs in your classroom, in the school setting, in the community as well. I'll pause there for any questions that are coming up about these roles or what that means for educators' context, especially as we're navigating. I'm going to say this over and over. You guys are going to think I'm a broken record by the end of the day, but especially as we navigate this over hybrid or distance learning models. Anything coming up for us, Dana?
Aren't any, but I did see one more comment from your question earlier that I'd like to read, if you don't mind, because I feel like
yes,
you would
please.
appreciate this. Sure. What are suggestions for building? Oh, wait, there was one more comment, and then there is a question now.
Okay.
My peers discuss sports coaches and school personnel as being very important support systems. As sometimes the school may have been dysfunctional, or sometimes the home may have been dysfunctional and the school was the sanctuary safe place. Okay, so we do have a question. What are suggestions for building relationships and supporting students whose families are not engaged by choice because of work, foster care, broken home, teen parents, etc.? Like building relationships with families not engaged.
Yeah, that's a great question. This is a disadvantage of not being able to see face to face, but I would answer that question with a question, which would be, how are we defining engagement? So it sounds to me like this is a communication question primarily. So how do we get in contact with, or how do we have back and forth conversation with families that are not currently active or disengaged? And let me know, Dana, if there's additional context added as I talk through my response here. But we are going to move through some relationship building strategies. I think first and foremost, it depends on the age of the child, right? And so we want to make sure that we're being developmentally appropriate in how we enter that relationship, both with the student and with their family. And then using information that we have about the home circumstances or the family circumstances without making any assumptions about what that means. And we're going to talk in just a little bit about how we check our assumptions as we enter relationships, how we monitor our own personal biases or thought patterns, but being realistic both about what we know to be true about a child in their living circumstances and what we might be inferring, and being really careful in navigating those two things as very distinct, and operating from fact as much as possible, and then thinking about how we could leverage maybe secondary relationships to reach out to that family. Maybe there's a sibling or a former teacher who has a connection. But again, we're going to dive deeply into that moving forward. Thank you. Anything else there, Dana?
Not so far.
All right, great, thank you. So last thing to think about here, we do have, and we'll share this website with you at the end of our presentation today, but New Mexico has a statewide framework for family engagement on the website nmengaged.com, not to be confused with Engage NM, which is a different program, also doing great work for kids and families, but nmengaged.com, and this quote is from one of those elements of the framework. And Zach, I guess you're my dedicated reader today. Sorry to put you on the spot again. If you could give this one voice for us, please.
The foundation, I have the foundation up over on this quote, right? For foundation.
Starting with school staff.
School staff and parent groups. Oh dear, I'm having technical difficulties. Apologies.
No worries. You want me to get this one?
School staff and parent groups can make a critical contribution to student success by ensuring that all students have an advocate, whether it's a family member, teacher, or community volunteer.
Awesome, thank you. And I saw earlier when we did polling that we have representatives of all of these groups in this call today. But notice that the language here says whether, and then consider for a moment what it would look like if it were all of the above, right? So we know that a child has stronger outcomes and has better access to success and achievement if they have an advocate, if they have a strong ally and supporter in their corner. And what if it were all of the above? What if our counselors and our families and our volunteers and our educators and our coaches were really able to come together as a group like you see in these kind of pixelated people, apologies for the graphic quality there, but we're really able to come together in support of one child, one student, and let that child and student know you have a whole community here supporting you, loving you, caring for you, rooting for you, and giving you what you need to be successful. And then what does that look like to replicate that level of community? I'm sort of making this embracing motion with my arm, right? That wraparound support for every single child in our school community. And how do we do that in a way that is deeply meaningful without, very realistic moment here, adding hours and hours and hours of work onto our day, right? So how do we prioritize relationships as sort of this guiding light for how we move through education with our children, as opposed to making it feel like extra work for us. So speaking of the work, we're going to talk a little bit now about the core components of family engagement. And there are really three essential pieces. We had that goal statement earlier that was very comprehensive, very wordy, lots of language there. But we've broken it down here into just three essential components. And that's developing authentic relationships. Part two is sustaining those trusting relationships. So just like any human relationship in your life, what do you need to do to nurture and to feed and to nourish that relationship over time? And then the third is fostering meaningful partnership. And we're going to talk a little bit today about academic partnership, but I want to be very clear that even as I say academic partnership, that we're talking about the whole child. We're talking about the socio-emotional well-being of our children. And this is not just ABC's 1, 2, 3s, right? This is a very comprehensive partnership that we're discussing today. So the first piece here, somebody asked earlier about how do you build those relationships? So 3 things to consider as we're developing authentic relationships. And we use that word authentic very intentionally because it requires a great deal of reflection in thinking about how we're moving into these, again, not chosen, but very necessary relationships with students and families. And the first part is to just think about who are you and how are you showing up? So as you call your families, as you're getting ready for back to school this fall, how are you going to welcome them into the learning community, whatever that ends up looking like for the next few weeks? And how are you going to introduce yourself? What is it that you want them to know about you? How would your introduction in this circumstance change from if you were meeting somebody? Remember, we used to go to coffee shops and bars and restaurants when the world was open, right? If you were meeting somebody for the first time, or a dinner party, right? Whatever your level of comfort is, how you introduce yourself there versus how you introduce yourself here. What is the distinction? What do you want to share about who you are and how you're showing up? The second piece is establishing shared expectations. And so this can be very technical, right? It can be very tactical, meaning I'd like to see the homework folder signed and returned every Thursday, and I'll send the folder home with a weekend activity on Fridays. That might be an expectation, and it's very technical and tactical in nature. But we also want to have these deeper relational expectations and have a really honest conversation with families at the outset of the school year, not just saying, here's what I expect of your participation as a member of my classroom this year, but also asking families and sort of modeling vulnerability in this way. What do you expect of me? So what are some of your expectations of me as an educator, as somebody who's helping to care for the intellectual and socio-emotional growth and development of your child? So I'm going to pause here and ask for a little bit of audience participation. I'm actually going to stop sharing. And on that note, around shared expectations, if you could just type into the chat box here, what are some things that you hope for this school year? What are some expectations that you might communicate with your families and students as you move into the fall? I think without seeing your faces, it's really lovely to see and sort of feel this like-mindedness, this shared, thank you, gentlemen, this shared mindset of really rooting in that sort of holistic well-being and tapping into where our students and families are as they come into the school year. Establishing that open communication from the beginning, and really thinking about what that means for how we model that in relationship with our families, right? How we're setting the stage for that kind of sharing at the beginning of the year. Engaging virtual class that families would like to engage in with their child. That would be wonderful. You know, from our family perspective, none of us, as educators, of course, we've not done this before. We experimented with it a little bit in the spring, but this is going to be very different, right? And so inviting families into that newness could be very exciting and really transformational for what we're all about to see. I'm going to come back to our slides here. Oops, I'm not. Can you guys see that same slide again? Family with the red t-shirt, thumbs up. Fantastic. And the last one here, so hopes and dreams. I included this as a real core component and also as part of my own personal bias about how I approach family engagement work. In the last program where I worked, we did a lot of home visit training. And I know that with the diversity of roles that we have on our call today, probably everybody has a different vision of what comes to mind when I say home visit. So to be very clear, when I say home visit, I'm talking about what would be sort of like a normal coffee chat, right? It's a relationship building check-in, introduce yourself, get to know the family, get to know the child in a place that is not the school building, right? So really decentering the power that our institutions hold as the school is sort of our house as educators, and moving into community and into relationship with families in an intentional way. And one of the key components to that conversation on a relationship building home visit is addressing hopes and dreams. And this can be a truly eye-opening experience for families and educators in a number of ways. And I say a number of ways because sometimes you hear things as hopes and dreams that you wouldn't expect, right? You wouldn't never know, oh, this child has a dream of becoming a Broadway musical star, right? But you also might hear things, for example, the first time I had a home visit, nobody had ever asked me this question before. And even as an early childhood teacher mom, as I call myself, mother of two, and educator of hundreds, I had no idea how to answer this question. And I was floored, and it was a deeply emotional experience. And we hear that from a lot of families say, you know, we have these very technical and tactical conversations oftentimes between school and home, but rooting in that place, again, of authentic relationship and saying, not just, I want my child to be at grade level learning their math homework, which I know we all have tons of jokes about the new math, right? Especially those of us working with elementary age children. But what do we really hope and dream for our children? What does success look like? What do we value? And how do our core values inform our definition of success? So something to keep in mind there. Pivoting pretty hard from that nice warm feeling of thinking about our hopes and dreams and connecting, want to be very honest that sometimes there are roadblocks. Sometimes in entering new relationships, especially ones that are with people we may have never met, especially ones that are rooted in a virtual experience like we're having today, we have this challenge of relational trust. And it can be a barrier, and it can be for a number of reasons. But part of what we're going to explore today is how that relational trust is rooted in our identity. It's rooted in the biases that we hold. And when I say bias, I mean a very simple definition: preference for, preference against. And it's rooted in how we feel authentic or not, right, as we're entering those relationships. The woman you see on your screen here, her name is Verna Myers. She's a diversity consultant and expert, and she gives a wonderful TED Talk. And it pops right up if you Google Verna Myers TED Talk. And in this talk, she talks about how our biases sort of do this thing in our brain that necessarily impact and influence the way that we show up in the world. And she says, biases are the stories we make up about people before we even know who they actually are. She goes on to say that her suggestion is that we walk toward the discomfort, that as soon as we see something, we say something to ourselves, and we move towards that discomfort, we move towards our biases, and we sort of stop ourselves from creating stories. I often use this analogy of back when things were a little more publicly accessible, people watching, and this game that we sometimes play, whether we're at the library or the park or the coffee shop, and we say, oh, look at this guy over here. I'm pointing at you, Zach. You're the Hollywood square to my bottom left. Oh, in his white business shirt, he must be a business traveler on vacation. And we sort of make up these stories about who people are and where they're coming from. And it can be kind of, fun, right? But the thing that allows our brains to do that is that we are automatically filtering the visual information in our environments and assigning meaning to it based on our own identities, experiences, and biases. And so I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this notion of bias so that we can think about how we're checking in with ourselves as we move back into establishing relationships. And normally here I would sort of post check how many people have had some sort of bias training in their career as an educator. So if you have, and this is repeat for you, feel free to make connections or additions in the chat box. If you have not, and this is a newer conversation, feel free to type up any reactions that you're having as well. But as we unpack bias, it's important to note, again, this sort of core, this foundational definition that a bias is simply a preference for or against something. And we have two kinds. We have our explicit bias and we have our implicit bias. Our explicit bias, as this little cutie is showing us, is something that we can announce. We can say it out loud. We know what it is. It's easy to name. We're not afraid to name it. And sometimes we're quite proud of it. Our explicit biases, to offer a few examples, can be something as simple as, I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts, and so I have a very strong baseball bias in my family. I have a strong preference for the Boston Red Sox and against that other team from New York, who shall remain nameless. Apologies to any New Yorkers in the crowd in advance. I probably just isolated anybody with that geographical background. I'm very sorry. But it can be something like, you know, sort of as surface level as that, or something deeper, something much more important to us, like your preference between red or green chili, or your pedagogical preference, right? So I said earlier, I'm a Montessori teacher. I have certain pedagogical preferences. I have biases when it comes to education and how I want to see my children learning and how I like to support other children in learning. So our explicit biases, final example, very time sensitive here, is who you voted for in the last election, right? That comes from this place of biases, of preferences, this set of preferences that we hold. Our implicit biases are a little trickier. As this young gentleman is showing us, we don't always know what they are. They're implicit because they're under the surface. A lot of folks, when they talk about implicit or unconscious bias, they use the iceberg analogy. So we know about this much about ourselves, and then everything else is under the surface, and we really don't know what exists there. And so as an example, and as a means to model vulnerability with all of you new friends today, the anecdote that I provide here is Harvard University offers a series of implicit association tests. Again, pops right up if you ever want to look for it on the Googles. It's Harvard IAT is the acronym that they use. And what these tests do is they assess your implicit bias. They assess your preference for or against a person, place, or thing. And most of these are human-centered, right? And so they have this whole series of different identity-based IATs that you can take and participate in. And as somebody who's done a lot of work in this space, I started taking these tests early on and take them often. And the one that always catches me, and I'll have to tell you a little bit more about myself in order for this to make sense, but is the gender implicit association test. So I grew up in a two-home situation, mother's house, father's house, with essentially a single working mom. My mother was an attorney. I was surrounded by a number of working women in my childhood. I was raised by a feminist father in the other house. And I've grown up, I've been working pretty much every day since I was 13 years old. So I consider myself a career woman. I'm also married to a career woman. And most of my friends are women in the workforce who have some sort of professional engagement. So, and you can tell I'm getting a little nervous as I share this story with a room full of faceless strangers here. So I took this test. I had taken some of the other implicit association tests, and I'm thinking, oh, thank you, Michelle, for showing your face. That was so thoughtful. It's an SEL conference after all, right? Thank you also, Janelyn. And I can only see like 6 people here. So if there are other faces popping up, thanks to you too. But so I took this test thinking, okay, I knew given my own identity, the skin I'm in, my background, what some of my other results might be on these implicit association tests, just given the socialization and conditioning and of my experience. But I was sure I would ace this gender test, right? So you go in and it basically shows you, like you see 2 little guys on your screen right now. It shows you pictures and it's a visual reference, and you click, 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 good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. Or, you know, strong, weak, or smart, not, whatever the categories are. And at the end of the test, Harvard tells me, Katie Avery, you have a strong preference for women at home and men in the workplace. Not slight, not moderate, but strong preference for, again, women at home and men in the workplace. And I thought to myself, gosh, the test must be broken. Right, that's our first go-to when something doesn't go the way we wanted it to. Oh, this was a lousy baseball bat. Oh, the test must be broken. This doesn't work. But there are all of these articles and additional research pieces that tell you that if you start blaming the test, then you know you really have a problem. So I started reaching out in different ways and saying, gosh, you know, to friends and family members, can you believe Harvard told me I was a raging sexist? I can't believe this. And I started thinking, you know, Katie, this probably has shown up in a few places for you. And rather than freaking out, it would do you a better service to dive in there and think about how that's shown up. And one of the first things that came up for me in reflecting on this was in the classroom. And I, along with hopefully some others on this call today, was a teacher when there were still landlines, right? Like the phone that lived on the wall or on a table. So you would just call home, right? That's what you would do. You would call home. Who do you think I assumed was answering the phone when I called home? Always mom, right? Or my primary point of contact was mom or a maternal figure in the child's life, which really did a disservice and discounted relationships I otherwise could have had I been aware of and explored this bias a little earlier on, right? And so thinking back to some of those initial relationships that I had in my family engagement and in my educational career, and to this day, I'm still friends with a lot of the mothers of my former students. And so I share that anecdote as one way of thinking about how we have these things we don't even know are there, and they're really uncomfortable to name and to face, but absolutely influence and impact the way that we enter relationship. So a few more things, and this is research, not Katie Avery driven, to know about implicit bias are that we all have them. Dr. Shraki Holly out of LA Unified, and he's done a lot of work here in New Mexico around the CLRI, the culturally and linguistically responsive practices. Dr. Holly says it's your first thought, but it doesn't have to be your last thought, right? And I would go even further to say it's your first thought. You might not always know that you have it, but it's there. It's the first thing that happens in your brain, but it doesn't have to be your last thought. Verna Myers, who I referenced earlier, underscores this notion of we all have them. She says, we were all outside when the contamination came down, right? We all consume similar sources of information, whether it's media, traditional or social media, cultural images, the movies we watch, the music we listen to, the company we keep. She says, we were all outside when the contamination came down. The third thing to know is that they are deeply informed by our identities and our experiences, right? So who I am, where I grew up, the skin I'm in, my gender presentation, all of these things inform my biases. Our experiences as well, right? Whether we left home early to go away to school or to live with another family member, or if we're highly mobile in our living situation, this can inform our biases. The last thing to know is that they are malleable. So the jury's still out on whether or not we can 100% change them, but they are malleable, and there are things that we can do to diversify our exposure, to think about where are we getting messages from, to really impact the way that they influence our relationships. To be a little bit more specific, we can rely on this particular graphic. This is called the ladder of inference. And it basically outlines, and a lot of our counselors, or I think there were some school psychologists on the call, are probably much more familiar with the brain science than I. But what the ladder of influence outlines is the process that our brains take, all of our brains, all of us, no matter who we are, where we come from, in receiving and interpreting data. And by data, I mean who you're looking at, where you are, the circumstances that you're facing, right? So at the very initial level, we experience and we observe something. So we're taking in information. At the second level, we're selecting data that feels relevant, and we discard data that feels irrelevant. This happens automatically in our brains. And so your identity and your preferences, right there on that second rung, are already having an impact on shaping what's happening in your perception of an environment or a relationship or a family, right, or a classroom. Then we add meaning to those things, like that people watching game that I referenced earlier. We make some assumptions, right? So, oh, I had a relationship with a family who had similar circumstances, and so I assume this new family that I'm getting to know might be experiencing some of the same things, right? We sort of transfer prior knowledge into a new situation. There are times when this can be handy, right? So I want to be perfectly clear that I'm not sort sort of, as my kids would say, dissing your brain function, right? I'm not saying that this is a process that has to always be stopped. What I'm saying is we have to be able to filter out when it's serving us well and when it's not serving us well. So for example, if you went to an emergency preparedness training and they said, oftentimes when an earthquake hits, here's what happens and this is what you should do. Your brain, if you're ever in an earthquake, will go back to that training experience and transfer that set of information to the current experience. That's a time when it's really helpful, right? When it's really helpful to say, I'm making some assumptions about what we should do here because this is a dangerous situation. Or this is, you know, a circumstance in which there is a set of actions that's proven to be helpful, right? That's a positive situation. A situation where it's not quite as helpful is if we're making assumptions that may or may not be true, that then as we move further up this ladder, as you note, necessarily mean that we're drawing conclusions, we're adopting beliefs, and then we are acting on those beliefs in the way that we do or do not communicate and build relationship with families. So this can look like, I really appreciated the question that came in earlier about building relationships with historically disengaged families, because it really demonstrated a tremendous growth, open asset, however you want to call it, based mindset, and saying, we haven't counted this family out yet, or this child's home support system, whoever that might be, out yet. We just want to get creative and curious about exploring new ways to connect, right? So when we're thinking about sending out invitations to academic partnering events like conferences or whatever they end up looking like this year, making sure that we're doing that broadly, that we're always welcoming and that we're always inviting, and that we're not allowing those assumptions to influence those actions that we take. I'm going to pause here because, again, that was a lot of me talking. And Dana, I apologize. I know this isn't at one of our transition slides, but I'm going to pause for any questions that might be coming up before we move into the second core component.
I'm not seeing any questions so far.
Okay. Well, I'll move us forward, but as they come up, or Dana, if you notice anybody using the raised hand feature, feel free. And we're doing great on timing, guys. So if you're making a connection personally or professionally and you want to share that with folks, share something that's coming up for you, please also feel free to use that raise hand function and do so. Admittedly, I'm much more accustomed to doing this in person. So we're going to leverage technology the best that we can. So the second core component, after you establish an authentic relationship, and that can be through phone calls, video chats, FaceTime, a postcard, a letter home, whatever that looks like for you, is to think about how we're going to sustain that trusting relationship. This is when oftentimes folks in my line of work make really awkward first date analogies, right? Like if you go out with somebody and you enjoy their company and you want to connect with them again, you've got to find a way to continue to foster that connection, right? Again, these are necessary but not chosen relationships. We've got to find a way to continue to foster the connection. Or maybe our initial attempts weren't successful and we've got to start over and get curious about how else we might enter a relationship. But to the end of taking this anti-bias approach to relationships, engaging and education, we want to encourage you to continually check in, but don't check out. Right? It can get really uncomfortable. I'm sure you guys saw all of those nonverbal cues that I had in sharing my personal anecdote earlier. But that discomfort means that we're growing. It means that we're changing. And I don't have to explain that to the folks who are committed to the socio-emotional work on this call. But discomfort is part of the process and it can be really transformative. And so leaning into that and giving yourself a little space and grace to just experience that as it comes up. And then continuing to check in and continuing to reach out and nourish that relationship while also sort of monitoring where you are. We also really strongly emphasize the two-way communication, and some of the earlier comments in our chat box reflected this, that it's not just about us sharing out, but it's also us holding space for families to share in to the school community. And that it's really all about that just right information just in time. So a few years ago, I was part of a broad survey that was done with families asking them, you know, what's the best thing about teachers who have good family engagement? The question was worded much better than I just did. But by far and wide, families were saying, you know, it's when I get that really specific piece of information just in time with an aligned thing or way of being to address it, right? So when I think about how this means, in just a second, we're going to talk about the partnership piece. But when I think about communication back and forth, I need to know as a parent, and I hope that I'm being clear when I'm toggling back and forth between my educator and my parent persona here. But as a parent, I need to know not just if my kid is doing well in their math homework. I need to know if they had a rough day at school so that I can respond to that and I can be supportive in different ways, right? And I need to know not just if they're doing well in their math homework, but what is that specific thing? What is that high leverage piece of information, or forgive this word, data, right? That I can use to inform how I'm supporting learning at home, how I'm monitoring my child's growth and development over time. And similarly, as educators, I'm toggling back, as educators, we need that information from our families as well, right? We need to know without that ever awkward question of, did something change at home, right? It's awkward to ask, it's awkward to receive it as a family end, but if we haven't that deep, authentic, trusting relationship with the family, they'll let us know if something changed at home. Or they'll let us know, gosh, you know, Enzo was working on homework last night and they just were so stressed out, they were crying. That's a real key indicator for a teacher. I need to know so that I know how to navigate and support learning for that child moving forward. And then the final piece here is this notion of seeding and sharing power. And that's why I talked a little bit earlier on about this notion of building relationships outside of the school environment. So taking it away from where all that power lives in our house, in our school buildings and facilities. But taking that one step further and sharing power and sharing in this relationship with families so that we're co-creating solutions, that we're co-creating strategies, and that we're co-creating what does meaningful support for this child look like, right? Because we all know it's not a one-size-fits-all model. And we may be the pedagogical or psychological experts in child development. Families are the experts in their child. And so we've got to share that expertise two ways and make sure that we're co-creating as we think about supports for individual children. Are we ready to have small groups again? So we're going to break out. Welcome back, Jackie. We're going to break out in just a second and think about last spring and give yourself space to experience anything that comes up when I reference last spring. I know that we all had a lot of different experiences and reactions to the sudden closing of our schools and then navigating what that meant for engaging with our students and families, balancing our own priorities at home and with work. So as you're creating space for all of that to come up, I want you to also think about what was your primary means of communication with families during that time, families and students? Who did it include? And who might have been excluded from that communication? So really honing in on this communication piece. We'll break out for, I think, 5 minutes here into those groups of 4 or 5, however the math works out. Jackie, I trust you.
Absolutely. The rooms are now open. You should be able to join your room.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who shared in their groups. It's been really great to hear where people are dialing in from also. One of my goals this spring was to do a bit of a driving tour of the state and get to know, hopefully, some of you all as I journeyed through different districts. But we have had to adjust a little bit and now are relying on virtual engagement opportunities. So it's nice to connect with folks from across the state. Let me see. Can you guys now see number 3? Fantastic. Thanks for the head nod, Jackie. So the third core component, we talked about establishing authentic relationships. We talked about communication as the key to nourishing and sustaining those relationships. And the third part is what often lends itself to a little bit more of a technical and tactical approach, as I talked about earlier, but it's fostering meaningful partnership and thinking about how we continue to welcome families throughout the year. And so we start with this piece as sort of an emphasis for this is not just about the sort of academic strategies of sharing homework folders and sending packets or math strategies home, but it's that ongoing welcoming. So how do we continually establish a learning environment, a classroom community, a school culture where all of our children and families feel a sense of belonging? There is some research actually that shows there are 4 main mindsets that children need to have to be successful in the environment. And again, it's sort of this natural synergy between some of the SEL frameworks that we're familiar with. But the first and most important one is the sense of belonging, that a child has to be able to walk into a space or enter a virtual learning space and feel like I belong here. And that's true for our families as well, because they're an integral part of that relationship. The other piece is knowing that hard work can pay off. So this sense of sort of self-efficacy, that success and achievement is possible. And the third of the fourth, and we've been having increased conversation and work around this here in New Mexico especially, is making sure that that learning experience is relevant. Right, so we talked a little bit in nourishing that relationship about the anti-bias approach to engagement. We also want to ensure an anti-bias approach to education and making sure that that environment, that learning environment, is culturally and linguistically relevant and responsive and sustaining for our children. And that is part of this second piece, which is supporting the whole child. So balancing our goals within this partnership around both intellectual and socio-emotional growth. We recently conducted a statewide education survey here in New Mexico from families, and we got a lot of really interesting information. I don't think that we shared this link in advance, but we'll share it after the session. You can see the results from this survey on our website, but we asked families about their experience and how sort of their level of satisfaction, gauging their level of satisfaction and how that changed before and after the switch to distance learning, around how the school and classroom supported their child's intellectual growth and how it supported their socio-emotional growth. And socio-emotional growth especially is something that families really expressed a preference for additional support in after the switch to distance learning. So really strong emphasis on including that as part of our partnership goals as we enter this new school year. And finally is informing advocacy. So again, making sure that families have the access, the knowledge, the resources, and are encouraged to exercise their agency in advocating for their child, and that we hold space and leave space for ourselves to do that as well as educators. And this is not to say, again, if we're ceding and sharing power and acknowledging that teachers are experts, educators are experts, support staff are experts, families are also experts. So when we say informing, equipping, empowering, that's not from a deficit-based perspective. We know that families are already whole. They are already complete, and it's important that we see and validate and honor them for that. And making sure that we are continuously bridging. They have information that we need and we have information that they need. And so making sure that that informing is going both ways as well. We mentioned earlier, this planning for partnership involves a very robust and comprehensive framework that we've established here in New Mexico on that NM Engaged website. And there are 6 components to that framework. And I'm going to shift here because it's not big enough on this screen for this particular slide. And you'll get a copy of these. So if it's too small on your screen too, don't worry. But it's welcoming all families into the school community, communicating effectively, supporting student success, speaking up for every child, sharing leadership, and collaborating with community. That's sort of our 6-point framework for effective family engagement. And the website has a number of resources and strategies for how to do that. We're sharing just one of those with you about communication after today's session, but we do encourage you to go in if you're not quite sure where to start. And I know that I saw a couple of our school leaders on the call with us this afternoon, still morning, this morning. If you're not quite sure where to start, but you're really committed to either establishing or maintaining or building out a robust culture of family engagement in your school, for each of these core areas of the framework, which are different than our core areas that we've addressed just now, those top 3, for each of these elements of the framework, there's a self-assessment rubric. So you can click to that part of the website on NM Engaged and say, for example, collaborating with community. There's a rubric that you can sort of walk yourself or your school staff or your community or your colleagues through and thinking about, how are we doing? Let's assess our practice. Let's sort of see where we are. And then there are aligned resources and strategies for that as well. There's a whole comprehensive roadmap on the website, really a lot of information, but wanted to offer this as sort of an entry point, because if it's your first time visiting this site, it's a lot of information. So we want to make sure that we have a little bit of guidance and offer some suggestions for how to enter that site. I promised earlier that we would make some really explicit SEL connections for you. And so I'm going to sort of rush through these pieces because I know that we are a little short on time and I need to leave a couple minutes for my hosts here. So I'm just going to highlight at the top this website, thecastle.org/reopening with SEL. There are 4 critical practices, all of which have really robust connections with family engagement, all of which have additional resources and links that you can explore after our conversation today. So I encourage you to read through those, make connections as appropriate, click on those links, download the resources, share them with your friends and colleagues. A lot of natural synergy with what we talked about today. As we wrap, I invite you all to share strategies with one another in the chat box. I'm doing this because I imagine it's maybe on this side of your screen or maybe this side, depending on how my video is mirroring. You can tell I'm much more physical in presentation in person. But go ahead and share in your chat box, wherever it's appearing for you, some strategies that are coming up for you about welcoming families into the school community this year in these new circumstances, considering our conversation today, and use that as a space to share ideas and suggestions with one another. Here are the resources that we promised to share with you. And Ms. Dana or Ms. Jackie, I will hand it over to you for some closing remarks, but just want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I did not announce this at the beginning because I didn't want to call her out, but your New Mexico Teacher of the Year, Mandy Torres, has also joined us for the conversation today. Mandy, thank you for being here and for supporting the importance of family engagement and socio-emotional learning for our kiddos in schools. And without further ado, I hand it back over to our host. Thank you so much.